Hi folks. Today I have the opportunity to let you hear a little bit from Tara Vault, who is doing a qualitative study. And since I had just finished my summary of what a qualitative study was about, I wanted to ask her a few questions about her qualitative study to see if you can sort of understand in a real life situation what she is doing. So she is looking at, the title of her study is Swift College Graduates, 1983 to 1883 to 1955. The yes, you say it.
Generational influences of education in rural Tennessee for African Americans and the lives of their children.
So Tara came to me, I don't know, a year ago maybe, and was interested in this topic and knew a little bit about the history of this college, of Swift College, and was very interested and realized that some of the graduates were still alive, and so was very interested in trying to track down some of their stories. So first of all, sort of why did you decide to do qualitative instead of a quantitative study in this situation?
Well, actually, I assumed I would be doing a quantitative research study, but after I worked out my questions and identified the research problem or the gaps, then Dr. Trivett helped me to understand that in actuality I would be actually doing a qualitative instead of a quantitative, based on the questions that I was seeking, the information I was trying to abstract.
And what was specifically, what were just one or two of your questions? You have a lot of questions in your qualitative study. She may never get it done, but don't tell her that. So what are some of the questions that you're trying to answer?
Some of the questions I wanted to know was, why was this college started? Who started it? And what happened to the people who attended Swift College, because it was a historically black institution, and how did it end up in Rogersville, Tennessee? And then what happened to those people who attended, and how did they influence educational efforts for their children? What did they bring from that early college experience in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and help their children do better in life?
So the questions are very open-ended questions. The other issue that we had to deal with was that she was particularly interested in interviewing participants, people who had attended Swift College, who were now in their
late 80s, early 90s.
So there wasn't a big sample from which to even think about doing a quantitative study. But on the other hand, it wouldn't have answered your questions anyway.
Right.
Okay. Do you want to talk a little bit about sort of how you thought about sample and how you're thinking about sampling and how that's different in this situation than it might have been?
Mm-hmm. Well, I had to think about what the literature said and find literature on the subject. What the purpose was of this study, how I was going to collect my data, whether it was going to be qualitative or quantitative, how I would analyze it or interpret it, what tools would I use or methods, and then how would I write up a report and evaluate the data so that it could inform the answers to the questions I was seeking. So I looked at different theories, and we figured that grounded theory would be the best representation of what I was looking for, because it was in grounded theory, one of the aspects, or like three different aspects, but one of the aspects was about the emerging findings and the theories of a particular, of the participants. What did they share in common about their views, or the broader conceptual level about the substantive topic, and how that data that I would derive would be linked together to form a common theory or a category.
So there are, as you will notice in your book, there are multiple designs that Craswell talks about, and so she chose grounded theory because it was based partly on the population and on the context, whether or not it made the most sense, and then based on the kinds of questions that you were interested in. What was the commonality among these people who attended this African American college at a time when there was not a lot, and particularly in rural Tennessee, and how did their stories inform what happened in later generations? Were they similar or different, and how, kinds of things.
Right.
So,
After we figured out what kind of theory, because we had to look really in depth with each one, then we figured out what kind of sampling tool or method I would use, and we figured that snowballing sampling would work the best.
can you describe what snowballing is? Give them a little bit of a definition, and then, but more importantly, giving them an example, because you are clearly doing the snowballing method.
That's what I'm using now. It's the procedure in which the researcher asks the participants to become part of the sample, and also to recommend other logical potential participants. And it's worked out very well, because with each participant I have 3 separate groups: those directly who have attended or graduated, those who are on the peripheral who supported the efforts, and then those that are historians or in the community who may have been affected by the college where it resided in Rogersville. So each one of those participants may know another living participant or someone close enough to the study that could provide some relevant information and background.
One of the problems with this study in trying to find samples is that though there is information, it's very sketchy information, and it's piecemeal, it's not well located. There were some possible intentional destruction of historical documents at one point, and there's not really great lists of who went. There are, however, still reunions among those people. So they have consistently, there is a group who has consistently held a reunion, even though it's not in any formal way like your high school reunion was or is, and so those people are the best contacts. You got to remember the age of these people, and so she met someone not long ago who said, "Oh, I wish you had talked to so and so," and she had died just a month before. So her ability to get a list and go after a list was almost impossible. So she used the snowballing method, which is a great method in this kind of project.
Yeah, it works really well.
So talk a little bit about, you also are collecting data, and you're collecting data systematically. Talk a little bit about your interview protocols and sort of what you've learned not so much what you've learned from the data, but what you learned about how to develop interview protocols and how they're working.
Well, I had to think really deeply about what kinds of questions I wanted to ask the participants that I would be able to derive pertinent information for the study and for the research data that I'm trying to collect. So with each question I asked, it needed to be open-ended enough so that if the participant needed to provide more information, that would be great. I didn't want to have closed-ended questions because I didn't want yes or no answers. I wanted to know what their experiences were, what the influences were, and their personal oral histories. So I had to tailor the questions to fit each participant group. For instance, I had my questions laid out. I interviewed the first person and realized that I needed to switch 2 questions around or kind of revise them. So as I asked the question, I made a note about that, and so that I would be consistent with each other participant from that group and how I was asking the question.
So you started designing the questions for the people who had attended the school. So that was the first, because that is the essence of that's the most important group for her and most of where she's going to gather her information. But then she realized there were other people involved who had made this whole thing happen, and she had to so then what did you do in terms of taking those original questions and...
Yeah, so that was a little tricky because that's not something we really planned for. So I had to take the original questions and figure out how I could readjust them to fit the next particular group and then the next particular group. So that
and by group, she means the people who were the historians was one group, and then the community people who actually supported the development of this college in the Rogersville area. So those are the 2 groups she's talking about.
And so they would have slightly different questions than the actual participants, because the participants would not necessarily know certain information about the institution and how it came to be, or the history of the presidents. But in terms of the questions, they were very similar, but not too specific, so that I could really gauge and dig deep into the participants. And then I had to be able to read the mood and the willingness of the participants. So Dr. Trivett advised me, if someone seems bothered by questions, or their memories are too intense, whereby it's stirring up memories that cause some angst or tearfulness, I need to step back and say, we can be done now, and so I had to be understanding and considerate of their needs too.
Right. So one of the important things was that she is interviewing people who are 80 and 90 years old, and so just the sheer length of the questions and how long they can actually sustain that before they're just exhausted from it is a real huge issue. And yet we also had to struggle with the fact that we really could not be asking people to do 5 and 6 interviews. We tried to make this a 1 interview, but in some cases it has been 2 and had to be broken up. And people of that age, their memory doesn't fail, but they have to stop. And you're talking about a lot of years ago, and in some cases with these participants, these African Americans who have experienced this, you really are getting a lot of emotional, both good, very positive emotional responses, but sometimes some real sadness. And some of that's just because of their age, too. There is some sadness about who's not around anymore to tell this story.
Exactly.
So now what are you doing with, so sometimes she has 6 hours worth of interview data for one participant, and so tell them what you are doing with that now, which is kind of where she's still collecting data, but she's also really beginning to process her data.
Well, I've started the transcription process. So I'm listening to the videotape and the audio, and I'm pulling out the questions and aligning the responses to the questions as best as possible. And already in a couple, I've moved some things or just copied some things that fit in more than one question area.
So one of the things that often happens is you get information as you ask one question that's partly in response to another question. And in the way she's approached this, she's organizing her data by questions. You don't always do that in qualitative work, but in this case, she's got some specific information she's trying to gather. And so to help her sort of do that, she's using her questions as her first line of organization of qualitative data. And she's typing and listening and typing and listening. It's a very long and tedious process.
But there's a lot of history in there that needs to also be connected with there's concrete history, dates of, the Civil War, World War I, Civil War, World War II, Murphy Act,
Right.
Brown versus Board of Education, and then their oral histories and how they all connect.
Yeah. So putting together a timeline that sort of fits both the chronological dates and times, but also the historical events in these people's lives that are not sort of chronological or more just sort of how they went. So that's where you are right now.
Yes.
So tell them what your next steps are. You got a couple more interviews, and then what?
And then we're going to pull all of the transcripts together, sort it out, and categorize it, and then try to figure out where the common threads are. What's the most pertinent information that needs to be included in a write-up.
One of the struggles of a qualitative study is that she's continuing to find more and more people she wants to interview. and we are drawing some lines that probably wouldn't normally be drawn, except we have to get this done in a semester. It's an independent study. So there will be 4 participants, 2 people in each of the other 2 groups. Is that right?
2 or maybe
3 in the other 2 groups. So there'll be 9 people involved in this. So We'll probably get her to come back and do a video at the end of the class, at the end of the semester when she knows what she found. I have a very hard time keeping her talking about design and who she's talked to as opposed to what everybody has said, but we will get to that. Anyway, I just thought this would be a great example, a real-life example of a doctoral student here at ETSU who is in the midst of a qualitative study. So anything else you want to add to this?
Just thank you, Dr. Trivett. I think that when you have an idea and it's in the very, beginning stages and you're not quite sure, it's really important to have someone to guide you in the right direction. It's important to have someone believe in what you're trying to accomplish, because that makes all the difference.
Working together with other people is always going to make it easier for you to accomplish research. It's a team approach. It may take more than one person to raise a village, but it takes more than one person to create a good research project, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. All right, thanks, guys.
Thank you.